Hi folks, this is the second video on the film Waking Life. In this video, we're going to talk about the content of the film. Previously, the first video discussed the form of the film. Those formal features are the decisions that the filmmakers make to tell the story in a particular way and the significance that they have. When we talk about the content of the film in this video, we're talking about the action, the plot points, the bits of dialogue, and how those contribute to the philosophical meaning of the film. Ultimately, what we want to do is we want to use these formal and content features of the film in order to defend an interpretation of it. What is the philosophical meaning or message of this film? Now, when I say that, I don't mean to convey that this film will have one simple philosophical message. Interesting films are often ambiguous. That's what makes them interesting, that we have to actually think about it. It's not readily apparent on their surface what exactly is this film about or what is its message. Or maybe it has multiple messages. Maybe its message is really nuanced and complicated. So I don't mean to suggest there's one way of reading the film. What I want you to be able to do is defend one or more interpretations of the film by using the formal and content features. Okay, so let's start talking about some of the themes. One of the themes that I detected throughout the entire film is this question, whether we're dreaming or whether this is reality. Now, when we talk about that, this is called a distinction in epistemology in philosophy. Epistemology is the study of what we know. It's the theory of knowledge. And whether we know we're in a dream or know it's something that's reality, that's not just a question about what the world is like. That's a question about us as subjects. What is our contact with reality? And when can we know whether this perception is something real or not? Now, this is not the first film. This is not the only film to discuss this distinction between whether we can know what reality is ultimately like. Of course, The Matrix is like one of the great examples, but Inception, there's so many films that deal with this question about what the nature of reality is and whether we could ever know whether we're dreaming or not. This even goes way beyond filmmaking. So the question of what our knowledge of reality is really like, in its modern form, this traces itself to Rene Descartes, who was a philosopher actually who's going to come up a bunch in this class because he plays a really pivotal role in how we get to modern existentialism. Remember from the introductory videos to this class, we said that a key moment for existentialism in its modern form is the scientific revolution and this advent of a greater and greater secular society as a contrast to the medieval period where all of society was structured by religious beliefs and religious dogma and religious social order. Well, one of the key figures in the scientific revolution is Descartes. He was one of the leaders of the new science. He also thought that religion is compatible with the new science. So Descartes is not one of the atheistic philosophers who's trying to supplant religion with science. His role in the scientific revolution is to try to keep both of them, to have science and religion too, to show that they're not in competition, but actually are mutually illuminating. So one of his ways of doing that was engaging in this method of doubt. And Descartes asks us this thought experiment, can we know that we're actually in contact with reality or not? This will become an important theme later on in the course when we get to Kierkegaard. So I won't say too much more about it now, just that the film Waking Life already is asking us something with a long philosophical pedigree. Okay, so whether we can know we're dreaming or not is one theme. Let me say that connects with several other elements in the film. So whether we can know we're dreaming or not is a question about our experience and our perception of reality. And the nature of experience is something that comes up in many places, in many of the conversations. And it connects with this theme about communication, because our experiences, the sort of thing that are essentially private. I have my experiences and my perceptions, and you have yours. And you can't ever have my direct experiences, where each one of us is in this sort of solipsistic reality, disconnected from everybody else. And the sad thing about solipsism is it's really lonely if I'm the only person that I can directly know, or if I'm the only person who I can ever be really sure is here. So there's something about the way in which subjective experiences can naturally lead to us to think that there are these deep barriers to communication. Or the flip side, the more optimistic side, is to think that communication is perhaps our mechanism, our tool for overcoming solipsism. If we can actually communicate with other people, then maybe we can break out of this subjectivist barrier and come to mutual understanding and mutual illumination. How is it possible to do that? Well, one of the dialogues that comes up in this film, in the film, talks about words as systems of communication and symbols. And so maybe it is that these symbols, what words do is they get a meaning that transcends my subjective experience. They become interpersonal mechanisms or symbols of communication. Because when I say blue, that I might understand what that color is by my subjective experience of blue. But the word blue doesn't just mean blue as it appears to Ian. The word blue is an abstract word. It's something that actually all of us use the same word when we all say blue. So we use that to break out of our little solipsistic bubbles. Words are like these little symbols that we can travel between each of our bubbles and get contact with each other. Now, that's the optimistic thought. On the other hand, you might think that words, once they become detached from my little solipsistic bubble, they lose that contact with the way blue looks to me, and then they just become abstract things. They become dead once they become abstract and detached from my experience. So, if that's true, then words have lost this this hope that they could help us break out of our own experiences. What do we need then? What would true communication be like that transcends words? Well, maybe it would be in the realm of the visual. So again, think about what the filmmakers are doing. They are not just giving us words, they are giving visual experiences. And your perception of that film is a whole lot like your perception of reality. So the film, again, becomes a metaphor for a dream or reality. And maybe communication via film is a way in which you can actually have a kind of spiritual connection, or as this character says, spiritual communion with others is what we're really looking for with communication. That's why we want to engage in this shared social reality, so that we're not just stuck in our own interpretations, but we can actually have deep, meaningful contact with others. Maybe that's what the human condition inherently seeks. So besides communication, another theme in the film that connects with this and a similar existential issue is the theme of identity and authenticity. So this again comes up in several of the little vignettes and dialogues, and I think it's a really interesting one to wonder, what is the film actually saying about identity and authenticity? So one thing I think it says about identity is that this sort of narrative conception of identity, which concerns the first assignment, where you're talking about the sources of meaning in your own life. If you tell your own story, what is the story that you tell yourself? What are the main plot points in your own life that you think encapsulate and define in some ways who you are? Well, then if you want to explain your life, who you are in that way, in a sense, you're telling a story that constitutes your identity. Or in some ways, your identity is constructed out of the kind of story that you want to tell about yourself. And it's a lot like then the fictional stories that we tell. I mean, I guess in some ways, maybe there is always an inherent, some element of fiction in those stories we tell ourselves. We don't focus on all of our failures. We focus on all of our triumphs. We tell a classic story of heroism, a wonderful story of redemption. That's the stories, the narratives that we want to tell about ourselves. But maybe what we're doing is we're leaving out all of the dirty, dark secrets, all of our failures, all of the struggles that we went through in order to get to where we are. And that's in some sense giving one colored version of it, but that's neglecting a lot of the essential things. So maybe there's something deceptive about that. But telling these stories, maybe it's through pictures, but it's only through pictures if those pictures actually help construct a narrative that you actually have a certain kind of identity. Now, some of those fictions maybe are more or less true to ourselves. So the question of authenticity has to do with what is the story I ought to be telling? What is the narrative that actually conveys who I truly am? Is there any such thing? Maybe there's nothing but different narrative stories, different interpretations of me, but there's no true self behind all of those stories. That would be an interesting existential position too. But this quest for authenticity connects with the quest we talked about before for communication. These are interrelated aspects of the film. And what I think this does, the way that I want to interpret this, is the film itself becomes a metaphor for the story and the attempt at communication that it's telling us as the audience members to engage in. So it's like the filmmakers, Linklater and the other filmmakers, have created an object that illustrates for us what we ought to be doing. The film tells a story, and it helps us through its story convey to us that we should be telling stories about ourselves to construct our own identity and do that in as authentic a way as possible. And I don't think I'm just making this up, because the film has many self-referential aspects. It, of course, is, you might have noticed, it's not a totally conventional Hollywood film. There's no obvious plot line and storyline. There's no super clear character arc where characters and things, meet the events, all culminate in some grand climax with like some Transformers fighting, and then the world is saved at the end. It's not that kind of Hollywood story. This is what you might call an art house film or an independent film. It's a kind of film which really realizes that it's an aesthetic art object while being a film. So this talk about art not being the goal, I think the film is clearly talking about itself here. And if that weren't readily apparent, when the character says this is a movie projector. And let me tell you, whenever filmmakers put a movie projector on the screen, they are being self-conscious. It's no coincidence, because for one thing, there's just a long history of filmmakers doing this sort of thing. And somebody like Linklater would never be ignorant of that history. The same goes here. Look at this shot. And again, this is about mise-en-scène, the stuff I was talking about before. This is a projector screen. So what we really have here is we have a screen within a screen. And this is supposed to make us conscious of what's being portrayed on this screen and its significance for the characters who are the audience in that shot. But it's also supposed to make us think about how we are audience members and we're watching this film on a screen, and what significance does this have for us? Whereas these folks are the stand-ins for us. And this monkey, I think this is part of Linklater's joke. This monkey, this is like the script of the film, and this is like Linklater self-consciously making a joke that he's like the ape creating the movie. I think it's always nice when filmmakers are highly self-referential, but they don't take themselves too seriously, because there's something that's easily and deeply pretentious about making art films, self-referential art films. It's good if you can laugh at yourself at the same time. So when the film then, in this scene of the film, when they're in this small projection room, it then cuts to the characters, these people's faces. And I think there's something deeply referential here, because this is not just on a screen within our screen, but now in that second screen, we're getting projected back these faces, which I think are like faces looking in a mirror. So there's a third screen here, which is sort of the way in which this is mirroring the audience. And in my opinion, it's not just these audience members who are engaging in these kind of introspective moments, but this is supposed to be looking back at us, the audience members of Linklater's film. So I think there's many layers to the storytelling here. And this again heightens the theme, the question of whether the film is like reality or whether the film is like a dream, and what we're supposed to think about our experiences of the film, and thereby experiences of dream and reality. Okay, let me switch gears slightly. So I'm moving on from that scene, which was talking about the artifice of movie making, and that was portrayed in there. This next scene with this writer character does something similar, because films are not just projected on the screen, but films are first screenplays. They're scripts written by people. And this guy is a writer who's working on constructing a story. So in another way, this scene, even though it's quite different than the previous one, has this deeply self-referential aspect that makes us, it raises the question, what is the significance of this movie that Linklater has made? And what is the significance of the narratives that we tell about ourselves to make sense of our own identities and realities? So this character, this is so funny, I think. This is a hilarious bit of filmmaking, because this character is themselves really pretentious and self-aware and takes themselves incredibly seriously. But I think it's in a funny way. So this is a way in which I think the filmmakers like Linklater get us to laugh at this character, and in some ways laugh at his own film, so that we don't think that he's too self-serious. Notice that the way he's describing his own story, like there is no story. This is the character describing the story he's writing. It's just a bunch of people and gestures and moments and bits of rapture. Of course, he's describing the story he's making in the fiction, in the diegesis, but of course, that's a perfect description of Linklater's film. That's what waking life is. And so this question, when he asks, when the main character of Waking Life asks, are you in the story? Of course, there's two levels to this, because what we want to know is the first level is Linklater in Waking Life? That's something we should ask. And if you don't know it, actually, you should know Linklater is in Waking Life. So this is no idle question. He actually plants himself. There's a cameo in the film that he appears in. But also, the second level to this question is, are we in that story? Of course, the story, that our perception of reality, are we the main characters in that story? In some ways, yes, the stories that we're constructing about ourselves are fictional. There's in some ways in which they're not perfect, true representations of reality, but nonetheless, they are encapsulations of us and our identity. So we are going to be present in those stories. So we, the audience members, are present in Linklater's film too, just like we are present in our own narratives. All right. Now, I think there is some character arc to the film Waking Life. It's just not super easy to detect. But I think one of the key moments in the plot of the film is when the main character no longer is this passive recipient to his experiences, where he's sort of plagued by the dream experiences starting up over and over again. And it leads him to this moment of crisis. The key bridge, I think, is when he stops just being the passive observer in his dreams or reality, and he actually wants to become the active interpreter of them. So he starts interrogating people to try to figure out whether they're part of reality or not, or whether they're part of his dream. He starts to take an active role in it. And from an existential point of view, the way I read that is he's starting to take responsibility. He's becoming an agent. And that's a critical existential moment when you start accept that responsibility and take that level of agency. Again, notice the dialogue track here clearly invoking this self-referential aspect, because he's describing what his dreams are like. Of course, Waking Life is this strange movie or something with people going off all the time. Now, there's a couple of characters in the film which I think are really voicing moments of truth or key ideas, key perspectives that we're supposed to take on board. And this character says a few things that I think are in this direction. Although I don't think it's the case that we should just interpret any of these characters as the perfect voices of the philosophical position of Waking Life. But this guy has this really funny series of speeches where he talks about how fun rules, like we gotta grab life by the horns and enjoy yourselves. What we should do is become more and more self-aware. The goal is to become lucid. From an existential point of view, that means that's like the Socratic dictum. I read it as like, examine your own life, examine your interpretation of reality, and take a positive message out of that. Let that be the impetus for you to start enjoying your life and reality. There's one existential perspective that character gives voice to. He's the one who says this thing like, what you need to do is realize that you're dreaming. That's essential to enjoying these lucid dreams. Now, if that's the case, then that makes us wonder about the interpretations of the title again. Because is the goal to actually show that we can't distinguish between dreaming and reality? Or is the goal to actually establish that we can distinguish between them? And what we're supposed to know is when we're actually awake and when we're actually dreaming. Maybe we're always dreaming. Maybe reality is just like a fictional dream or story to us. So again, what I want to do is push you to make up your mind as to what you think the significance of the title is. Okay, one of these other really critical moments, I think, in the film has to do what I call, this is the holy moment scene. This is interesting because these guys are talking again about the reproduction of reality and the creation of reality in cinema. So this is a deeply self-referential self-referential episode in the film. This contradicts, again, this shows the ambiguities in the film. This contradicts the idea that cinema is actually just about storytelling. So think about how this relates to some of those other characters talking about how we create stories and we create stories about ourselves and construct our own identity as inherently fictions. This is talking about something else. This is breaking down the distinction between fiction and reality and saying what cinema does is reproduce this reality. That's a really funny thing to say. Think of how ironic that is to say that in this film, because this is animation. This is rotoscoped animation, which is nothing like highly realistic photography. So some filmmakers like Andre Bazin have these famous theories of filmmaking where films reproduce reality. But this is nothing like that style of highly realistic filmmaking. So this is something I think that's deeply ironic and really interesting. But the character, it gets even more interesting when the character talks about these religious dimensions to it. And he's, again, waxing in this very, very deep way, which can easily seem annoying or cloying. You know, film is like the ever-changing face of God. He sounds like he's taking himself very seriously. But then he has this great comedic stop where he says, oh, wait, you have a mosquito, and he slaps the guy he's talking with. So again, the film shows us that it's not going to take itself too seriously by breaking up the moments of rapture with some extremely mundane plot points or bits of storytelling too. So the use of comedy, again, is a really important feature of the filmmaking here. Notice the expressivism in this scene. So he draws this box as he's talking with his fingers, but the film actually literally draws a box for us. And notice what this does. Think about the mise-en-scène here. We see him within a screen. So he's in a screen. This box is like a little TV screen or a film projector screen or something like that. So we're seeing him doubled in some sense. And he's talking about how films can help us see these holy moments where the film, I think the moment that these two characters have, you know, and again, think about the use of shots. This is a two-shot. You know, we see them looking at each other. We see this eye line match between them, but then we keep going in on close-ups. You know, it's a little creepy, but I think this is sort of a beautiful moment too. I love this scene in the film where we're seeing the characters have a holy moment, but at a meta level, I think if you get it, if Linklater's film is working on you, then you should sort of have this tingly, holy moment. And there's actually a third level here, because remember, this is a film in a film in a film, because the main character is actually watching those guys talk about film. And so when he watches them have the holy moment, then this is again an invitation for us. If Linklater's film is actually working, I think the way it's intended to, we have this kind of holy moment, this moment of experience and insight. Is that experience completely ineffable? Remember those conversations about whether or not we can really communicate with each other, or whether our whole experience is solipsistic. Well, this is Linklater perhaps breaking out of those solipsistic bubbles and having us sharing his experience with us in what he intended. Just to hit the nail on the head or on the nose, but after that shot of the main character watching the film, they then cut to the projector looking at it. So here the camera is showing the projector, and this is again a really self-conscious reference to the mechanisms of the filmmaking. So this is an invitation for these meta-philosophical thoughts about the film. This is my attempt to convince you that I'm not just over-interpreting the film, but the film is actually directly inviting us into these philosophical speculations. Let me give you one more example of a character, and then I'll talk about some of the final significance of the movie. This character who has this speech about the Dostoevskian novel and with clowns, again, there's a lot of expressivism where the background is rendering these clowns that he's talking about on the dialogue track. The key theme that this brings up is this issue of co-authoring the dance, because co-authoring means taking responsibility. It means becoming active. So if the existential story is about us becoming active, if that's the ultimate message, we want to not just be passive observers in the narrative story of our lives. We're not just the passive observers where society and reality constructs our identity. We're not just the puppets in that story. If we're going to be authentic, we need to become the lead role. We need to be the drivers of the action in that story. Maybe that's the message that we should take away from this character's perspective. Okay, let's talk about authenticity and what it means to take responsibility. Because whether we're capable of doing it, I think, is one of the key existential questions of the film. And that ties back into the plot point about the main character. He is in some ways going along for the ride and enjoying, even if he is confused, this dream reality that he can't escape. But he eventually becomes plagued by the alarm clock starting over again and over again, and him attempting and failing to figure out whether he's in a dream or not. And he has this sort of existential crisis in the movie, and how he reacts to that. So I think this is sort of the climax in a sense. How he reacts to that then conditions what we think about the ending of the film. But in some ways, I think the film is telling us something. It doesn't necessarily tell us. So I think the ending is a bit ambiguous. We don't know exactly what the main character's solution is to his existential crisis, but I think the film does tell us what he needs to do if he is going to succeed. What a solution would look like to his existential crisis. And this goes back to the question about dreaming versus reality. So in many ways, I think what the film does is it tells us that it tells us a lot about dreams. I mean, that's the point of him continually having this question about whether he can tell he's dreaming. Dreams can seem meaningless and incoherent, but on the flip side, the dreams can also seem deeply significant and full of meaning. And what I think is ultimately the film is not just telling us something about dreaming reality and what dreams are like. I think the film is supposed to say that dreams are a metaphor for what life is actually like. So ultimately, the film is not about breaking down the distinction between life and dreams by saying that the two are the same. I don't think the film is saying that our lives are just dreams, or we could never know whether we're dreaming or not. Rather, breaking down the barrier between dreams and reality is to tell us that what the film says about dreams tells us something about what our reality is like. So dreams can be full of meaning, or they can be meaningless. And if dreams are like reality, then what that means is that our reality can be full of meaning or meaningless. So the way that film works as a mechanism, as a metaphor for dreams, allows dreams then to function as a metaphor for life. So if it's true that the one character says the trick is to realize that you're dreaming, on the interpretation that I want to give you, if dreaming is really a stand-in for what it is for living, and the reaction to dreaming is actually the message for how we ought to existentially react to living, then what it means is that life can be either meaningless or full of meaning. It could go either way. What we have to do is we have to figure out ways to make it the meaning one rather than the meaningless one. We need to take responsibility for co-authoring our lives and to construct meaning out of them rather than allowing them to just be an incoherent set of plot points. So I think this interpretation of the film connects with a whole bunch of those themes. Like, I'll just return to one of them, this theme about authenticity and identity. When we make up the story about our own lives, when we construct our identity, in some ways we have to tell a certain story, but that doesn't mean we just have to accept the story as given. We are actors. The story is not finished yet. All the decisions that we make actually construct that story. And if we're going to do this in an authentic way, we need to reflect and accept the responsibility we have for making those decisions in one way or another to make it the story that we want it to be. Okay, that's giving you one interpretation of the film. Now, let me say, if you want to disagree with that, that's great. Philosophy classes are not the kind of classes where you just have to sit back and listen to what the professor thinks and then write that down and then feed that to them on the final exam or something, or in the papers. I want to know what you think about the film. You can disagree with my interpretation. You can find a bunch of evidence that I didn't notice to marshal to strengthen my interpretation or to complicate my interpretation. So I'm giving you an example about how to interpret a film, how to to take various bits in order to spin an understanding of the philosophical significance of it. But that doesn't mean you should just accept the one that I'm giving you. And let me say, that doesn't mean that the film is unambiguous too. So I think the final shot of the film is actually deeply ambiguous, not because the film leaves it open what we should do, what the correct existential point is, but I think the film leaves open how successful the character ultimately is in accomplishing that. But again, you might think that I'm arguing for much too narrow of an understanding of the film that it really bears. And so I think that's great too. I'd love to hear it. So in this video, I talked a lot about the content of the film and how some of the formal features actually strengthen and provide a kind of unified message with a lot of the content of the film, and used those bits to provide one interpretation of what the philosophical position of the film is. But again, that's just one interpretation, and I'm really curious to hear if you have others. Okay, thanks.